In the spring of 1942, Japan believed the Pacific was theirs. The empire had swept through territory with astonishing speed. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Guam, Wake Island, each victory reinforcing the narrative that the Japanese Navy was unstoppable and that the United States was a beaten giant still struggling to get off its knees after Pearl Harbor. Japanese military leadership projected an image of invulnerability at home. The Pacific was their defensive moat, a distance so vast that no enemy could cross it with force, let alone with offensive intent. Tokyo newspapers printed maps showing the Pacific as a shield. America was too far, too damaged, too paralyzed. And for the American public, Pearl Harbor was still a fresh wound. The images of burning battleships, broken aircraft, and smoke rising from the naval base had carved themselves into national memory. Families grieved, steel production surged, and recruitment skyrocketed. But emotionally, the country was suspended between anger and helplessness. The question hung in the air like smoke. How do you strike back when the enemy is thousands of miles beyond reach? The answer emerged in a room where logic and audacity met. A plan so improbable that even some of the men who signed on believed it bordered on suicide. It wasn't born in the Navy's battleship corridors or the Army's infantry academies, but from an idea shaped by Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle, a scientist, stunt pilot, speed record breaker, and strategic thinker. The concept: launch U.S. Army B-25 Mitchell bombers not from land, but from an aircraft carrier, something never attempted before. Land-based medium bombers had never taken off from a carrier deck. The size, weight, and distance limitations made the idea seem reckless. But Doolittle understood the psychological stakes. America needed a headline that traveled faster than fear, a strike that announced to Japan and to American families scanning the newspapers each morning that the U.S. was not waiting for permission to fight back. This mission wouldn't destroy Tokyo or bring Japan to its knees militarily. But it might do something more important: puncture the myth of Japanese untouchability. To hit Tokyo was less about destruction and more about revelation, and revelations travel. Training began in utter secrecy. Pilots learned impossibly short takeoffs, pushing engines to near failure. They practiced deck launches on airfields painted with the exact dimensions of a carrier runway. A runway that would pitch, sway, and breathe under the weight of the ocean. They stripped weight from the planes, everything non-essential removed, and added extra fuel tanks that turned the bombers into flying canisters, barely held together by rivets and faith. The mission almost defied mathematics. Take off, strike Tokyo, and land not in friendly airfields but in China, hundreds of miles beyond the safe range of the aircraft. This was a one-way mission cloaked as round-trip strategy. The men knew it. Doolittle knew it. Washington knew it. But the mission was approved because morale was currency. And America, in early 1942, was bankrupt. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers roared off the deck of the USS Hornet. Sailors watched history pass overhead, machines never intended for the sea, now launched toward the heart of the empire. Tokyo civilians heard the engines before they saw the aircraft, an unfamiliar sound slicing through a sky believed to be impenetrable. When the bombs fell, limited in number, symbolic in force, the strategic maps didn't change, but perception did. Crowds looked upward in confusion, military planners reevaluated their assumptions, and radio broadcasts that once assured safety faltered. For the first time, the Japanese homeland had been struck, proving that America was not grieving quietly. It was preparing. The Doolittle Raid didn't win the war, but it changed the shape of it, one engine roar at a time. The training for the Doolittle Raid was unlike anything the U.S. Army Air Forces had attempted. Pilots were not told the target, only that the mission would be dangerous, unconventional, and voluntary. When they learned they'd be flying medium bombers from the deck of an aircraft carrier, a concept that naval strategists considered impossible, the room fell silent. The B-25 Mitchells were land-based aircraft with wings too broad, fuel tanks too shallow, and fuselages never tested against the saltwater winds of the Pacific. Even the carrier pilots aboard the USS Hornet were astonished. Some joked it bordered on madness. But the mechanics, engineers, and air crews set to work with a mixture of determination and disbelief. Bombers were stripped of non-essentials, armor plating removed, defensive guns replaced with broomsticks painted black to intimidate enemy fighters, fuel tanks added in every conceivable space. Every pound removed meant another mile of flight. Every gallon added meant another chance of reaching China. The crews trained on makeshift runways painted to match the exact size of a carrier deck, just over 500 feet, less runway than some pilots used for landing, now meant for takeoff. Engines roared at the edge of stall speeds while wheels lifted inches above asphalt. They practiced again and again, shaving off seconds until the impossible became muscle memory. Secrecy was so critical that even aboard the Hornet, sailors and officers speculated wildly about the mission's purpose. Some believed they were delivering aircraft to the defense of Hawaii. Others suspected a strike somewhere in the Pacific Islands. Only when the carriers were well underway did Admiral William F. Halsey send the message that echoed across the task force. "This force is bound for Tokyo." The reaction was electric: disbelief, adrenaline, fear. But before the bombers could launch, a problem emerged. Japanese patrol boats spotted the task force sooner than anticipated. The raiders were still hundreds of miles farther than planned for a safe launch. To turn back was to admit failure. To continue risked being intercepted before takeoff. The order came, a decision carved from urgency and audacity. Launch now. This meant they would run out of fuel long before reaching the safe Chinese landing zones. The pilots understood instantly this was now a near-suicide mission disguised as strategy. They prepared anyway. One by one, the bombers taxied forward. The deck pitched in heavy seas. Wind and steel conspired against them. Doolittle's aircraft would be the first. If he failed to lift off, if the bomber slid, stalled, or crashed, debris and flame would block the path for the rest. All eyes watched as he pushed the throttle. The engines screamed, and the bomber surged forward, skimming waves that towered like black walls. At the final second, the B-25 lifted, barely, clearing the deck by feet. The crew exhaled. Sailors cheered. The next took off, then another. 16 bombers in total, each carrying enough fuel to hope, not enough to guarantee. Behind them, the Hornet retreated, its role complete, its secret declared to the world by engines fading toward Japan. The pilots flew into the unknown: weather, fuel shortages, enemy patrols, and a coastline that had never been breached. They were not expected to return their aircraft intact. Some did not expect to return at all. But they flew anyway, turning the Pacific into a runway fate never intended it to be. Tokyo woke to a sound it did not recognize: the low, mechanical growl of engines overhead. Air raid warnings in Japan had existed only in theory. No one expected them in practice. The homeland was the fortress, the sacred center of an expanding empire, defended by distance and conviction. Residents looked up to see B-25s flying low over rooftops and factory districts. Some waved, mistaking them for Japanese aircraft on training missions, until bombs began to fall. The Doolittle Raiders did not have the payload to devastate Tokyo economically, nor the time to stage precise strikes, but they didn't need to. The first explosions shattered windows, ignited fires, and tore through industrial targets. The shock was not in the scale of destruction, but in the mere fact that it happened. Air raid sirens howled for the first time in the war. Civilians fled into streets and alleys, stunned that the sky itself had betrayed what they were told was impossible. Radios, once confident and triumphant, stumbled into frantic reports. Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe all felt the reach of a nation everyone assumed was reeling. Japanese military leadership reacted with disbelief that quickly hardened into anger. The Imperial Navy had assured the public that the Pacific distance made an attack impossible. Now, newspapers that had once mocked American weakness suddenly struggled to explain how U.S. bombers were flying over the emperor's capital. The propaganda machine, so polished and confident, lost its rhythm. The idea that Americans could strike Tokyo was worse than any physical destruction. It undermined the narrative that Japan alone controlled the tempo of war. The raid's psychological power spread faster than fire. Families who believed their soldiers fought on distant shores now feared that distant enemies could strike home. The Imperial War Cabinet faced questions not from the people, who were not permitted to ask, but from its own strategic silence. If the U.S. could bomb Tokyo once, what would stop them from doing it again? And again? The answer lingered in the smoke rising above neighborhoods that had never expected to see war descend from the clouds. Yet the moment was not triumphant for the raiders themselves. They still faced a deadly race against fuel. Many aircraft flew into worsening weather. Some crashed into the East China Sea. Others ditched or bailed out over rural China, where locals risked their lives to rescue them. One crew landed in Soviet territory and was interned. Some airmen were captured by Japanese forces in occupied China. A number were tortured or executed. A grim reminder that symbolism carried blood as well as meaning. Doolittle himself believed the mission a failure when he crash-landed in China. He expected court-martial, not celebration. He knew the bombs had been few and the losses high. But as news reached America, the effect was electric. Headlines declared confidence reborn. For a nation burning to respond to Pearl Harbor, this was oxygen, ignition, momentum. Ordinary Americans read the story and understood the message. The United States was not waiting to be rescued. It was fighting back. In Tokyo, leadership understood a different implication. Their war was no longer one-directional. The enemy they laughed off as slow, clumsy, and industrially inferior had just proven that distance was not protection. The Doolittle Raid did not win a battle. It rewrote the war's psychology. Japan's leadership needed to respond, not with words, not with reassurance, but with action. The Doolittle Raid had done little physical damage, but it had destabilized something far more important: the illusion of safety. If American bombers could appear over Tokyo once, they could do it again. And what if next time there were not 16 bombers, but 100? What if the United States began launching assaults not as retaliation, but as routine? The Japanese High Command concluded that the only way to regain psychological dominance in the Pacific was to eliminate the American aircraft carriers that made such raids possible. The carriers had been ghosts, elusive, opportunistic, hard to track. The Doolittle Raid transformed them into the primary targets of the Pacific War. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, proposed a plan to draw the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement. The bait would be Midway Atoll, a tiny strategic point in the northern Pacific. Yamamoto believed the Americans would send their carriers to protect it. What he didn't know was that American codebreakers had cracked Japanese naval communications, and the U.S. knew exactly when and where the attack would come. The psychological victory of the Doolittle Raid set in motion a chain of events that culminated at Midway, where Japanese confidence met American preparation and paid the price. The raid forced Japan to stretch itself thin. Bases were fortified across the Pacific, resources were relocated, defenses deepened, surveillance expanded. What the Japanese Empire had built in lightning speed now required maintenance, protection, and manpower. The Doolittle Raid proved that the Pacific was not a moat. It was a battlefield with shifting front lines, dictated by aircraft range, fuel, and intelligence. The raid's impact was felt not only in strategy rooms, but in the homes of Japanese citizens. The promise that the homeland was untouchable disappeared in a plume of smoke near Tokyo Bay. This loss of faith, subtle but corrosive, weighed on a country already strained by logistics and overextension. Meanwhile, in the United States, the impact was equally significant, but opposite. The raid galvanized a nation that needed proof that its sacrifices were not symbolic. Factories accelerated. Recruitment grew. War bond drives surged. The message that traveled across the Pacific was simple. America could strike back, and it would not stop. In that sense, the Doolittle Raid achieved what no bombing campaign, no fleet movement, and no speech could have accomplished. It changed belief, and belief shapes war. Midway became the Empire's turning point, the moment when Japan's offensive momentum stalled and the United States seized initiative. 4 Japanese carriers, not damaged, not chased but destroyed, were lost in the battle triggered by a raid that many, even within the U.S. command, had initially considered symbolic. The raid's physical effect was measured in debris and casualty reports. Its strategic effect was measured in the collapse of invincibility. Japan now faced a war where the enemy could strike anywhere, and increasingly, everywhere. Doolittle's bombers had not just hit Tokyo, they had hit the heart of strategy, forcing Japan to adjust to a war on terms they no longer controlled. The Pacific was now a contest of reach, risk, and retaliation. And the Doolittle Raid had shown that for America, retaliation had only just begun. While newspapers in America printed headlines celebrating the success, the men who flew the mission were scattered across enemy territory, facing storms, crash landings, capture, and death. Most crews bailed out over China under black skies and driving rain. Civilians risking their own lives under the brutality of Japanese occupation rescued many raiders and sheltered them. The price for helping Americans was horrifyingly steep. Entire villages were executed when Japanese forces tracked the pilots' movements. 8 airmen were captured alive. They endured isolation, starvation, repeated beatings, and interrogations. 3 were executed by firing squad. Another died from mistreatment in captivity. The Doolittle Raid had shaken Japanese confidence, and the response was unforgiving. Prisoners were not treated as soldiers following orders, but as criminals attacking the homeland. Their trial was a formality, their sentence predetermined. For the families of the missing, the truth arrived slowly, sometimes years later, with details concealed by both sides of the war. In Japan, captors debated whether the attack justified the death penalty. Ultimately, fear overrode diplomacy. For the men in captivity, the war was reduced to a windowless room and the echo of their own thoughts. Survivors later recounted the uncertainty, whether America knew they were alive, whether rescue was possible, or whether the world had moved on. Some found strength in faith, others in camaraderie, others in sheer refusal to break. The treatment of the Doolittle prisoners became a lasting scar, one of the war's many reminders that symbolic victories carry human cost. And yet, those rescued returned home to a reception even they did not anticipate. Jimmy Doolittle, fully expecting court-martial for losing every aircraft, for risking lives, for leading men into a mission with slim chances of return, instead received the Medal of Honor. He was lifted on the shoulders of success he believed had been failure. The White House and the American public saw what he had not, that the raid's impact had traveled farther than any bomber could fly. For the survivors, the legacy was complex, pride mixed with grief. They knew that the mission had shifted the war's momentum. They also knew that the line between heroism and sacrifice was measured in the space between planes that returned and planes that did not. The Doolittle Raid had become legend, but legends often conceal the ground-level truth that victory has never been free. The planes fell, the pilots scattered, the families waited, and history kept the headline while the human cost remained quieter, heavier, longer. The Doolittle Raid occupies a strange place in the history of World War II, a mission that achieved little tactical damage, yet delivered one of the war's most decisive psychological blows. It was proof that wars are not won only through territory captured or tonnage destroyed, but through belief. Belief in ability, belief in resilience, belief that the enemy is not invincible. In 1942, Japan believed its perimeter was impenetrable. The United States believed it was reeling. The Doolittle Raid changed both. It ignited a country still stunned by Pearl Harbor and reminded Americans that retaliation was not a distant promise, but an active reality. It forced Japan to defend expansively rather than attack selectively, stretching its supply lines and accelerating the strategic miscalculations that culminated at Midway. It revealed that large nations could use small operations to send enormous messages, that the purpose of a mission is not always visible in the debris it leaves behind. The raid's true payload was not explosives, but doubt. Doubt in Tokyo's war narrative, doubt in the empire's invulnerability, doubt that the Pacific was the buffer propaganda claimed it to be. Today, the raid endures because it encapsulates something timeless, the impact of audacity. 16 bombers leaving a carrier deck in rough seas should not have been possible, yet it was. Reaching Tokyo should not have been possible, yet it happened. Returning alive should not have been possible, yet many did. Survival in China should not have been possible, yet some were hidden, protected, and smuggled to safety by civilians who paid the ultimate price for their courage. Doolittle, expecting discipline, received honor. The raiders, expecting obscurity, received a legacy. And history, expecting a footnote, received a turning point. The Doolittle Raid is remembered not for what it destroyed, but for what it declared. That America was not finished. It was only beginning. In a war defined by machines, fronts, and nations, the raid reminds us that moments of daring can reshape the arc of conflict. When the engines roared over Tokyo, the message carried farther than the bombs. It said that belief could change direction, that momentum could be forged from resolve, and that retaliation, when it arrives, does not always come in numbers. Sometimes it arrives in 16 planes that shouldn't be there, over a city that was never supposed to hear them, flown by men who knew the world needed proof that the fight was far from over.